has a hard-on.
Perfect world was a dream between primitive cerebrals.
He's a traitor! He's a sadist!
You're all going to die down here.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Good tidings, my truth seekers. Welcome to Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, the always approachable, comprehensive, and affable discussion about the world's favorite and least known heretics, the Gnostics. As is customary, we will strive to stay away from scholarly pontification and definitely stay away from New Age babble. We'll take the middle path through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy in this frank discovery about Gnosticism and his brethren in the esoterica.
So my father once said to me, "You don't choose the things you believe in, they choose you."
And that's not the only needle we will thread. As you might have figured out by now, we must career in between good and evil, law and chaos, right and wrong, conservatism and liberalism, theism and atheism, Ginger and Marianne, and all the other lower syzygies that grind out conflict until we are drowned in disinformation.
This is supposed to be a happy occasion. Let's not bicker and argue about who killed who.
No, the goal here at the virtual Alexandria is to rise above all dualities, unite them once we tower above them, and synthesize them into even greater truths.
I know Kung Fu.
In that event horizon of transcendental wisdom is where we will find the liberation of the consciousness and the sobriety of gnosis. I mean, wasn't it Aristotle who said that the mark of true genius is to be able to hold up equally two opposing ideas at once? Think of gnosis as holding up all opposing spiritualities at once until they become harmonized. More or less, that is.
I haven't got a brain.
My name is still Miguel Connor, otherwise known as your host, Abraxas, the terrible god above god as the ancients knew him. Thank you so much for emanating yourselves this Sunday, September 10th. If you get a chance or 20, please visit my website, thegodabovegod.com, for all the latest tittle-tattle of the revolution I began in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria. As the last great scholar before the Dark Ages arrived is quoted as saying, "Fables should be taught as fables, myths as myths, and miracles as poetic fancies. To teach superstitions as truth is a most terrible thing. The child mind accepts and believes them, and only through great pain and perhaps tragedy can he be in his after years relieved of them. In fact, men will fight for a superstition quite as quickly as for a living truth, often more so, since a superstition is so intangible you cannot get at it to refute it. But truth is a point of view, and so is changeable." Take that to the bank, my truth seekers, and give the angelic mafia and his large penis boss the finger while you're at it.
I made you, and I can break you just as easily.
Today we discuss the Gospel of Philip, and, by default, the Valentinians, since their hand is all over it, and several other works in the Nag Hammadi, or NHL. Our astral guest, Andrew Philip Smith, does a meritorious task in our interview in deciphering this very abstract, metaphorical, and mythical work. Like what Gnostic work throughout history isn't, right?
Oh God, did you eat all this acid?
But I have no doubt that you'll come with a better understanding of one of my favorite esoteric gospels and, in essence, open that third eye into further understanding the psycho-spiritual genius of the Gnostics. I'll just go and say right now that the key to the Gospel of Philip lies in one of its passages. Truth did not come into the world naked, but it came in types and images. The world will not receive truth in any other way. That says it all, or it all is said right there. Or perhaps for those of you theists and atheists who just can't stand anything other than a direct, solid, and packaged answer, allow me to quote Carol's Alice in Wonderland. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." How's them apples, literalists of the world? Ha! Sorry, my friends at the Free Thought Media chat room. You know better than to get a direct answer out of this egg.
Now you will see me one more time if you do good. You'll see me 2 more times if you do bad.
It is certainly imperative, if you want to understand Gnosticism, to know about the Valentinians of the 2nd century, named after the poet-teacher Valentinus. Elaine Pagels, in her book Beyond Belief, explains that the Valentinians numbered only in the hundreds in Rome, but were hated and feared by the growing Orthodox Church that imitated and grew like a parasite upon the Roman Empire.
Denial is the most predictable of all human responses.
Irenaeus of Lyons rants plenty against this very educated, sophisticated, and egalitarian Gnostic sect. One of the many reasons being that they cared little to argue with uneducated bishops and priests about theology. They usually just nodded their heads and agreed at whatever polemics or balderdash was sent their way. Yet the Valentinians considered themselves Christians. Not just Christians, but the highest evolution of Christianity.
Inconceivable!
You see, my true seekers, the Gnostics, and actually all the pagan world in antiquity, believed in the tripartition of man. Humans were segregated into hylics, psychics, and pneumatics, Greek words for body, soul, and spirit types. To the Valentinians, these weren't just divisions of essence, but levels of attainment. Hylics were mortals who lived in the domains of mundane preoccupations like sex, food, sleep, and probably politics. Psychics were mortals who had risen to the levels of the mind and ego, and were immersed in such preoccupations as love, careers, good and bad deeds, and being happy, and so forth. At the top were the pneumatics, who outgrew the ways of the material world and understood the mysteries of the divine. In the Jesus mysteries, Freke and Gandhi propose a 4th aspect to man higher than the pneumatic level, which is called the mystic level, where all is one and a person no longer sees distinction. To Valentinus, beyond the aeons and syzygies of the intangible world, existed Bythos, which translates into the deep, and his main squeeze, silence. These were the supernal concerts and the source of the all. And then everything spilled out in personhoods and potentials until that cataclysmic event in which Sophia got knocked up and gave birth to our Creator God.
I am the devil.
So in a sense, the Valentinians were very similar to the other Gnostic sects, albeit far more philosophical and complex. The most striking difference, as I see it, is that they were softer and extremely inclusive in their theology. For example, besides enjoying rubbing shoulders with Roman Christians, they were more positive about the Orthodox Jewish traditions, and even believed that the Demiurge, or Jehovah, or Samael, or Saklas, or Yaldabaoth, or Satan, whatever you want to call him, would be redeemed in the end. In fact, once the celestial cycle ended and the cosmos dissolved, old Yahweh, or Yahweh, as Price calls him in The Bible Geek, would assist many of the souls back home. What a nice lion-faced dragon, eh?
I don't need forgiveness from a pussy like you.
But returning to the tripartition of man, which certainly has parallels to the chakras, you might wonder what happened to this Hellenistic system. Well, sometime in the 10th century, I believed, Pope Nicholas, but don't quote me yet on the name, decided that people had become just too stupid, which is a common side effect of theocracies, and thus he got rid of the spirit or pneuma, which actually means breath in Greek. Hence we were left with body and soul and a lot of bad songs about them.
But now you know the rest of the story.
So, please allow me to quote from the essay Valentinus, a Gnostic for All Seasons, by Stephen Heller, namely the section The Almost Pope, so you can get a better idea of who this master was and what might have been if the powers of freedom had succeeded in Rome. J.R.S. Meads, the great early translator and theosophical interpreter of Gnostic documents, called Valentinus the great unknown of Gnosticism. And indeed, it is true that we do not possess much information regarding his life and personality. He was born in Africa, probably within the territory of the ancient city of Carthage, around or before 100 AD. He was educated in Alexandria, and in the prime of his years transferred his residence to Rome, where he achieved a high degree of prominence in the Christian community between 135 and 160 AD. Tertullian wrote that Valentinus was a candidate for the office of Bishop of Rome, and that he lost the election by a rather narrow margin, or should I say narrow. This same failed Orthodox Church father, Tertullian himself joined the heresy of Montanism, alleges that Valentinus fell into apostasy around 175 AD. There is much evidence indicating, however, that he was never universally condemned as a heretic in his lifetime, and that he was a respected member of the Christian community until his death. He was almost certainly a priest in the mainstream church and may even have been a bishop.
O Lord, bless this thy hand grenade, that with it thou mayst blow thine enemies to tiny bits in thy mercy.
It is certainly a question of some interest what the course of Christian theology might have been had Valentinus been elected to the office of Bishop of Rome. His hermeneutic vision combined with his superb sense of the mythical would have probably resulted in a general flowering of the gnosis within the very fabric of the Church of Rome, and might have created an authoritative paradigm of Gnostic Christianity that could not have been easily exercised for centuries, if at all. Tertullian also stated that Valentinus was personally acquainted with Origen, and one may speculate with some justification that his influence on this Orthodox Church father was considerable. The overall character of his contribution has been accurately summarized by J.R.S. Mead in the following manner. The gnosis in his hands is trying to embrace everything, even the most dogmatic formulation of the traditions of the Master. The great popular movement and its incomprehensibilities were recognized by Valentinus as an integral part of the mighty outpouring. He labored to weave all together, external and internal, into one piece, devoted his life to the task, and doubtless only at his death perceived that for that age he was attempting the impossible. None but the very few could ever appreciate the ideal of the man, much less understand it. And this is from Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, page 297. Continuing with the essay of Stephen Heller, Valentinus, the Gnostic who almost became Pope, was thus the only man who could have succeeded in gaining a form of permanent, positive recognition for the Gnostic approach to the message of Christ. The fact that circumstances and the increasing flood tide of a regressive pseudo-orthodoxy causes efforts to fail must be reckoned among the greatest tragedies of the history of Christianity. Still, many essential features of his unique contribution have survived, and more have recently surfaced from the sands of the desert of Egypt.
Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, is that it?
So now let us proceed to our interview so we can further understand Valentinus and the mysteries of the Gospel of Philip, including why Jesus and Mary Magdalene ran around making out. Andrew Philip Smith is the author of The Gospel of Philip, Annotated and Explained, and The Gospel of Thomas, a new translation based on the inner meaning. I highly recommend you visit his Gospel of Philip page at bardic-press.com/Philip phillip.htm. You'll find a plethora of sapient articles and translations on the Gospel of Philip, the Apostle of Philip himself, the various Gospels and Acts and legends attributed to the Apostle Philip, information on Valentinius and the Valentinians, and a pirate's trove of early Christianity and Gnosticism. Take a look, because if you're not careful, you just might learn something. And perhaps, just perhaps, rise from your hylic and psychic levels and into the breathless breath of the pneumatic paradises.
Sometimes there is so much beauty in the world. I feel like I can't take it.
And this is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. With us today is, whoa, I just blanked out. With us today is Andrew Philip Smith. How are you doing today?
Fine, well.
So far. Before I blanked out. We're strangers in a strange land. But
the Gospel of Philip has something to say about names, and
yeah.
we have to reach around the reality of names.
Yes, I want to find the truth of your name. Yes, that's it. As you point out in your book, The Gospel of Philip, which I really enjoyed, is that what we know today is it's not really a gospel, but actually an anthology. And do you think Philip was actually written by many people and compiled, or do you see, I know you refer him as Philip, but do you see many authors putting all these sayings and stories together?
Well, yes. I mean, that's a convention of scholarship, that even though, I think there's hardly a single gospel that any scholar will say is actually written by the purported author. They still refer to the author as Mark or Matthew or Philip or Thomas, just as by way of convention. And yes, the Gospel of Philip is most likely an anthology. We don't have any background information about it. We just have to look at the text itself. And if we look at the text, you can see that it's quite fragmented. You have a paragraph about one subject, a paragraph about another subject. And some of the insights are even contradictory, at least in terms of the imagery they use. Like in one place, Hebrews might be referred to in a complimentary way, in another place they might be denigrated. So there are quite a few of these contradictions in the Gospel of Philip. And the best explanation that I've seen of that is that it's an anthology. And there were many ancient anthologies. There's a scholar, Martha Lee Turner, who wrote an entire book arguing that Philip was an anthology, and she compared it to anthologies of philosophical writings and poetic anthologies. And of course, the reason that people in the ancient world would use anthologies is for pretty much the same reason as we do it today. It's expensive for a book to be copied. I mean, everything was copied by hand, and the papyrus or the parchment was expensive, and you had the time of the scribe. So most people couldn't afford to have an entire library of the works that they wanted. So an obvious alternative to that is that you copy out excerpts from a variety of books. You copy out the excerpts that you're interested in, and those are formed into an anthology. So you have material from a variety of sources sort of collected together, which is really, I mean, if you buy the Oxford book of English verse or whatever, then you get the best poems by the most famous poets without having to buy 100 separate volumes of poetry. So I think for somewhat of the same reasons. Now, it's not definite that this is an anthology. I mean, that is what makes the most sense to me. And Stephen Davis actually suggested that it was somebody's note. He compared it to the notebooks of Kierkegaard, which it doesn't quite work for me. He hasn't argued it in detail. I mean, there is a lot of similarity in the material that's there. It's partly because it's all Valentinian Gnostic material. As probably we'll get to later, there are certain themes come out in it. But it does make sense that it's an anthology, and we can even see, in certain places we can see that the authors probably used the Gospel of Thomas, for instance. Mm-hmm. There are sayings from the Gospel of Thomas that crop up in the Gospel of Philip. So it's quite possible the Gospel of Thomas is one of the sources.
And why do you think Philip was given authorship? You point out that he's only mentioned once in the whole Gospel of Philip.
Yes, and that's only the Apostle Philip tells a story about Joseph the carpenter having created the cross that crucified Jesus. Well, if we're being generous, there may have been a tradition of writings connected with Philip. There's also the Acts of Philip, which is one of the apocryphal acts from the 3rd century. Apocryphal acts all having common stories of the apostles. I mean, there's also an Acts of Thomas and Acts of John, with very extravagant situations and a lot of connections with the Hellenistic world. And I mean, in the Acts of Philip, Philip actually casts a spell on scribes who are giving him trouble. And a few of the sayings, or a bit of the material in the Gospel of Philip, just a tiny amount, comes up in the Acts of Philip too. So there may have been a tradition connected with the name of Philip, just as there was a tradition connected with the name of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, the Book of Thomas the Contender. So that's on the generous side. On the other hand, everybody wanted to use the name of an apostle or somebody, closely connected with the very earliest phase of Christianity. And as we can see, it's not a gospel. It doesn't. It's not directly concerned with Jesus or a historical or even a legendary Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings, and the canonical Gospels, the life of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus. I was just thinking this today. It's possible that it didn't have a title. The Gospel of Philip is in Codex 2 of the Nag Hammadi library, and it follows directly after the Gospel of Thomas. Now, a number of these texts didn't have titles. For example, the Exegesis on the Soul doesn't have a title. That's just the title given to it by scholars. In which case, I was speculating that if it didn't have a title, since it follows the Gospel of Thomas, the scribe may have decided that he needed to put a title at the end in the way that they did it in those days. So he thought, well, it should be a Gospel of something, and Philip is mentioned. I mean, Levi is also mentioned in it, Levi with his dye works. So it's quite possible that they just grabbed on the name of Philip and it became the Gospel of Philip.
Right, and I think as you point out very well in what's the Pistis Sophia, Jesus makes Philip the scribe to write down all the things. Could that have been part of it too, or the legendary?
Yes, that's another example of the Philip tradition. Yes. And then he also crops up in a few other places in the Nag Hammadi text. Interestingly, the Gospel of Truth, which is quite possibly written by Valentinus, who was the founder of what we call the Valentinian movement, that also doesn't have a title. It's in Codex 1. And the Gospel of Truth, those are actually the first words in the text. And then Irenaeus actually, he said that the Gospel of Truth was written by Valentinus, but what we have actually doesn't have a title to it. It's been given a title in the first few words. So there's another example of a gospel that isn't, really it's a sermon or an extended meditation. It's not a gospel in the sense of being directly concerned with the life and teaching of Jesus.
You mentioned the Valentinians. Who were the Valentinians, and how do we know that they have their hand in the Gospel of Philip?
Right, well, the Valentinians were a Gnostic group who, their name comes from Valentinus, who was a Gnostic who was born around the beginning of the 2nd century and died somewhere around 175 AD. Now, how do we know that the Gospel of Philip is Valentinian? It's occasionally there's a bit of Valentinian terminology, like achamoth, which means the Syrian word for wisdom. And also the general interpretive method used in the Gospel of Philip is very Valentinian. The use of allegory, symbolism, metaphor, and particularly the metaphorical or allegorical interpretation of Scripture is very Valentinian. So when you were speaking earlier about it being an anthology, it's not just an anthology, it's a Valentinian anthology. And one of the ways I tested the hypothesis of it being an anthology is I went through a range of Valentinian scripture or Valentinian texts, and I just tried to excerpt a little bit to see whether they would fit into the Gospel of Philip. Because after all, if we're saying that it's an anthology consisting of excerpts from Valentinian texts, then you should be able to put other Valentinian texts into it. And it worked very well. I went through the Epistles of Flora, the Treatise on Resurrection, the Gospel of Truth, and all these things, and they fit very easily into the Gospel of Philip and the kind of interpretive methodology that it uses. Now, the Valentinians themselves, they initially anyway, they didn't call themselves Valentinians, and they didn't call themselves Gnostics, they called themselves Christians. And in fact, although I'm sure that the term Gnostic is the right term for us to use for all of these groups, very few of them actually refer to themselves as Gnostics. This was a way of the heresy-hunting church fathers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Hippolytus. It was a way they had of distancing them from Christianity. It's not, to us it doesn't sound insulting, because it's based on gnosis, which partly the meaning of that is direct knowledge of God, direct personal knowledge of God or the Spirit. So to us it doesn't sound as an insult, but in its time it was a way of distancing them from Christianity. So they called themselves Christians, and as far as they were concerned, they were pneumatic Christians, Christians who had the Spirit, rather than the psychic Christians, Christians who only had the soul, which is what they considered the sort of exoteric, external, conventional Christians to be. As part of the process of distancing these people from Christianity, Irenaeus called them Valentinians, and perhaps certainly they looked back to Valentinus as their founder, so it wasn't an insult, but as far as they were concerned, they were Christians. And one of the interesting aspects of the mission of Valentinus and the way that the Valentinians, at least the early Valentinians, interacted with other Christians, is that they weren't quite as revolutionary as other Gnostic groups. There is a certain amount of the Gnostic technique of inverting the meaning of Scripture, such as where the serpent is actually the one who gave knowledge from texts. So there is a certain amount of that, and there are a couple of examples of that in the Gospel of Philip. But for the most part, they actually attended Christian services along with other Christians. What distinguished them from other Christians is that they interpreted the Scriptures allegorically and symbolically. And also they had some other activities going on. And so Irenaeus found this very disturbing, because he couldn't tell which ones were Valentinians and which ones were ordinary Christians. And he felt that they were wolves in sheep's clothing, because they did everything that ordinary Christians did.
Right, they attended Mass, they did the Eucharist and all that. So
that's right, and also they had the same morality, really. Some Gnostic groups were accused of hideous child-murdering orgies. As far as we can see, for the most part, Gnostics actually had a morality which fits in fairly well with the Christian morality. So Valentinus was somebody who really wanted to fit into the church, and I think direct it from within. He was happy for people to continue with the external practices of the church and the external morality and all that. But he also taught the esoteric meaning of the Scriptures. So he came to Rome about a third of the way through the 2nd century, and he was very involved with the Christian groups in Rome. And he was actually up for election as the Bishop of Rome in the middle of the 2nd century, which translates to Pope, basically.
Right.
So But he didn't make it. And from then on, there was somewhat of a distancing between the conventional Christians and the Valentinians. Although it did take generations.
Is it true that he basically came in second place, and or we simply lost out?
I don't know if he came in second place, but he lost out anyway.
Imagine the church if he had been the Pope. What direction the church might have taken, huh?
Yes, we might have had a genuinely Gnostic church. Well, possibly. Except, I'm sure as things progress through the centuries, there's always a falling away from the initial impulse, and then some sort of renewal of it. Certainly, Gnosticism was exiled from the Christian church. But there were still, as things developed, there were still spiritual movements within the church. There were rather severe ones, based on monasticism. But still the writers of the Philokalia obviously had a strong esoteric spiritual understanding. And they came from the monastic tradition.
And the Valentinians were, from what I've read, were a lot more positive than the other Gnostic groups. I mean, they believed that they weren't as antagonistic towards the Jews, and they even believed that the demiurge Yaldabaoth would be redeemed, didn't they?
Yes. In the cosmology, there is a shifting up of everything. As people whose souls become connected to spirit escape, then there's room for a shifting up from matter to soul and from soul to spirit. And also, I do think in what's termed the anti-cosmic aspect of Gnosticism, this world is a world of ignorance, of dead matter. There's something in that probably can't survive for very long. It can't really become an established religion and continue throughout the centuries. I think that's more, that has more of a temporary aspect to it. You can keep coming back to that, but I think there's just something that doesn't lend itself to civilization based on, on those concepts. Whereas with the Valentinian approach of the esoteric interpretation of Scripture, I think that that is something that can coexist with conventional religion.
Right, and the Valentinians also, he claimed to have direct apostolic succession from Paul, didn't he?
That's right, yeah. I mean, all these things have to be taken with a pinch of salt, because everybody wanted connection to an apostle. But I don't see any reason why that shouldn't be the case. He said that this is from Irenaeus, who was doing no favors to the Valentinians. So that's something in its favor, that he was unlikely to make it up. That Paul was the teacher of Theodos, who was in Alexandria, and then Valentinus was taught by Theodos. This Valentinus came from Alexandria, which was the literary and intellectual capital of the Greek-speaking world. In fact, of the entire Western world. So, I mean, as you mentioned to me in an email, the Gospel of Philip does give the impression of being the product of educated people.
Right.
People who have an interest in language, who are interested in interpretation. And by all accounts, Valentinus was a brilliant man.
Right, and it's hard to accept that it's a Roman work. For some reason, I keep thinking instinctively it's Egyptian,
Oh, yes. Well, also Syria is a possibility. Syria was a real...
Yeah, that too.
Hotbed. I mean, the Thomas connection is... whether the Gospel of Thomas was written in Syria or not, there's definitely a Thomas tradition in Syria. And then Syria was the home of... initial home of Manichaeanism, which actually did become a world religion. Although it was completely separated and persecuted by Christianity, that really was a Gnostic world religion.
Then you definitely see in Valentinus and his writings through the heresiologists, and even in the Gospel of Philip, you do see Pauline ideas permeating in it, right?
Oh yes, yes. And even direct quotes from Paul. Elaine Pagels put together a book called The Gnostic Paul, which consisted of Valentinian comments on the writings of Paul. There are a lot of them that survive. So, and that gives extra weight to the tradition that Valentinus was, as it were, a grandson of Paul in terms of the lineage. And also in Paul, I mean, if you look for the origins of Gnosticism in early Christianity, Paul is the place to go. Even though he's often quoted as being opposed to Gnostics in Corinth in the letters to Corinthians, certainly Gnostics didn't feel that way. There's a lot of Gnostic interpretation of his writings. And of course, Marcion, who is arguably Gnostic, he based his canon just on the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul.
Right, and he brought the Pauline letters to Rome. I think some scholars have said he might have been the author, like Robert Price and some others. So.
Yes, well, that's the radical school of interpretation. But if you mess about with those things, then you have nothing to stand on whatsoever. I mean,
yeah, might as well say Simon Magus wrote him.
Yes, right.
Which is kind of ironic, like you point out in your book. The Gospel of Philip is Gnostic, but yet in the Acts of the Apostles, it is Phillip who convinces Simon Magus to go to the light side, if you would.
Yes, one of these strange ironies that, I mean, we don't have anybody, we don't have a factual account of what happened. We only have competing points of view, really, in terms of the first century. But anyway, Paul uses metaphor a lot, and also allegory. I mean, he has a couple of allegorical interpretations of Genesis and the Torah, and he uses metaphor a great deal, even to the extent that sometimes you're not quite sure what he's saying. When he talks about the law or circumcision, when they're never quite certain in places whether he's speaking allegorically, and sometimes he says that he's speaking spiritually. It's not meant to be taken literally, but some things must be meant to be taken literally. It's partly why he's so confusing, I think.
Right.
He switches between the allegorical and the literal meaning of these terms. So the kind of allegorical interpretation and use of metaphor that you find in the Gospel of Philip really does go back to the earliest Christianity. And although I'm not sure we can prove this historically, personally, I'm influenced by writers such as Maurice Nicoll, who provided interpretation of the Gospels, that they're actually intended largely as metaphor. When you start to try and deconstruct the Gospels and you look for historical Jesus, you find that so many of the episodes in the life of Jesus are based on Old Testament stories, or have some similarity to Hellenistic, contemporary Hellenistic sayings or stories. But as I'm sure writers such as Robert Price or Tim Freak have emphasized, Jesus almost disappears when you analyze these things. So I'm fairly convinced that at least a major part of the Gospels in the New Testament, they were intended to be understood allegorically.
Yeah, and certainly Paul was not concerned at all with a historic Jesus. That was the least of his worries.
Yes. Well, if he was, then he knew next to nothing about him.
Another thing about the Gospel of Philip, and I've heard it called, it's the sacramental gospel, because it does talk about, it just brings 5 sacraments into it. Is this the first time we hear of an itinerary of sacraments in Christendom, or were they already in practice before the 2nd century?
Well, some of the sacraments are unique to the Gospel of Philip, really, or to Gnosticism. I mean, we do have some clues in Irenaeus regarding the sacraments, but then he's always tending to distort things and emphasize their difference to usual Christian practice. But in the sacraments that I mentioned in the Gospel of Philip, we have a baptism and a chrism and a Eucharist and a redemption and a holy bridal chamber. So baptism and the Eucharist are obviously rooted in very early Christian tradition, because we have Jesus being baptized by John. And the Eucharist is, of course, mentioned in Paul. He speaks about the Lord's Supper and how in some places it's being abused and people getting drunk instead of celebrating it properly. So they're not unique to the Gospel of Philip or to Valentinianism. You know, if you look at what a sacrament is, it's a form of ritual which has there's particular weight put upon it. And I think there are a couple of important aspects to that. One is taking part in the ritual. You have a heightened sense of presence during those times. And I think that's a major and important part of these mystery.
Just like Joseph Campbell said, a ritual is a reenactment of the myth.
Most modern churches are still founded on rituals. And then the other aspect of it is that, what you say with the myth is that to a certain extent there's an encoded meaning in it. And I think particularly with the Valentinians, their ritual practices must have been heavy with symbolism, just as their writings are. So I think a sacrament, it's something in itself. You have a heightened sense of the importance of your life and of perhaps being more in the moment while you're doing it. But also there's meaning in every little aspect of it.
What about the one is, or the one that the most striking one is the bridal chamber, kind of where the yin and the yang become one, and the Logos and Sophia are married. Stephen Heller, he proposed that, back then marriage was not a sacrament. So what the church did is they corrupted the bridal chamber and made it into a sacrament. Do you see this? What do you think about this?
Well, I was actually thinking that today. I was thinking less about the bridal chamber, and if you try and work out what it might have been as a sacrament, you come up with these orgies. Again, it's to do with the heresy hunting church fathers who like to imply that kind of thing.
The gospel is it's very sexual. So that way I can get more viewers and sell more books, but it is very sexual.
It is sexual symbolism. And occasionally people, there's one example in the Gospel of Philip where actual sex is the defiled bridal chamber, which does have imply a negative attitude to sexuality. And that's often picked up on to show that, people assumed that the Gnostics had a negative attitude to sexuality, because if you have sex, then you have children, and then you have children, you're bringing these divine sparks of spirit down into the world of matter and imprisoning them.
Right, more slaves to the ark.
Yes, which I think is a misunderstanding, really. For the most part, I think the Gospel of Philip has a very unembarrassed attitude towards sexuality, and just the image of the bridal chamber itself is a sexual image. The bride and the groom make love within the bridal chamber. And it's worth noting that a wedding is, perhaps it's not considered a sacrament, but it's still an important religious ritual in most faiths. Perhaps these list of sacraments, again, it's another way in which the Valentinians can carry out a practice which is also recognized by other Christians, but for them it has a whole different internal meaning.
And even in the Old Testament, the metaphor of marriage, Israel married to God, and all that, and all the sexual imagery in Solomon is still there, so it's not something that's should have been that controversial to the Judeo-Christian world.
Yes. Well, I'm sure here we're inching our way over to Jesus and Mary.
Yeah, how did you know? You got me. It just can't be avoided. We live in the damn brown world.
Yes.
So what do you think of those passages that have brought up so many conspiracy theories?
Well, yes. Well, there are the two passages. There's the one where Jesus was always accompanied by three Marys: his mother, his sister, and Mary Magdalene, who was his companion. And then the other one is where Mary Magdalene was kissed on the something or other. We usually assume that it's the mouth.
Yeah, but there's actually a lacuna there, so nobody knows. It could have been the cheek or somewhere dirtier. I don't want to think about it.
Yes. Which is, of course, quoted as another example of Jesus having a sexual relationship with Mary. Now, for me, the major difficulty with that is that everything else in the Gospel of Philip is allegorical, it's metaphorical, it's symbolic. So I don't see any reason why we should suddenly seize upon this as being a literal document of Jesus' sex life. And then if you take them seriously, I mean, are we really meant to literally believe that 3 Marys walked with the Lord at all times? You know, his mother and his sister and his girlfriend were all called Mary, and they accompanied him at all times. And then the other thing is with the kiss. Actually, just before the section about the 3 Marys in the Gospel of Philip, we have the perfect are conceived through a kiss. Thus shall we kiss each other. We receive conception from the grace which is in each of us. And that connects for me with a piece in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus says that anyone who drinks from my mouth shall become like me.
Oh, yeah. And
now I'm sure this was a metaphorical usage, and it sounds rather strange to us. When somebody teaches, they speak, and the speech comes out of the mouth. So drinking from somebody's mouth or kissing them is a way of receiving the teaching. No, I'm fairly sure that that's what's intended in terms of the metaphorical meaning there.
Right, and so yeah, I mean, it seems Jesus had chosen, or Mary Magdalene was the one who got the gnosis, because he even says, or it says, Jesus loved her more than everyone else, and when the apostles ask him, he doesn't deny it. He brings up a parable. So it just seems to show the Mary Magdalene as, you know, the Gnostic heir of Jesus.
Yes, yes. And of course, there are plenty of other references to Mary in Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Mary, the Dialogue of the Saviour. And this is also a common technique in which one apostle or disciple is denigrated so that another one can be raised. Like in the Gospel of Thomas, Peter and Matthew say the wrong thing, and Thomas says the right thing. And then I'm sure in other places, Peter says the right thing.
In the Gospel of Mary, Peter is just downright rude to Mary. Yeah. Well, he is in the Gospel of Thomas too.
But even in the Gospel of Mark, and there was a tradition that Mark was Peter's secretary.
Right.
Peter's actually put down all the time in the Gospel of Mark. He comes up with the wrong thing.
Yeah, he's kind of the bumbling sidekick, you know. He's Watson to Sherlock Holmes.
Yes. It actually makes me more sympathetic to him. He wasn't the grand. In most of these, he wasn't the grand commanding disciple. But actually, in most of those Renaissance paintings of Peter, he looks like a boozer.
Really?
He's got like a red nose and staggering about. So, I can't really take part in the sort of Peter hating that seems to go along with the interest in Mary Magdalene. I mean, everybody has their faults, and Peter's is certainly spread across the pages of the New Testament.
Something that I saw both the Gospel of Philip and Irenaeus describing the Valentinian cosmology referred to a place called the Middle, which is supposed to be the worst place anyone can find themselves in. What exactly is the Middle? I mean, we're talking, this is probably a doctrine before there was a hell created by Augustine, right?
I mean, the hell mentioned in the New Testament is Hades.
Right.
The word, I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that one.
I'm just very curious because in the Pistis Sophia, Jesus takes the apostles to this place called the Myths, which is the worst place you could think of because that's where all souls are lost and there's these horrible gods. It's worse than chaos. So I was just wondering if the Middle was maybe a precursor to the Myths of the Pistis Sophia.
Yes, well, we have I'm leafing through my Gospel of Philip, trying to find this one actually. See if I can remember what I said about it. But it's actually, in that particular section of the Gospel of Philip, which I haven't found yet, but it mentions the world, the middle, and the resurrection. So I think that corresponds to body, soul, and spirit trichotomy. In fact, I think that's one of the keys to the interpretation of the Gospel of Philip. When we meet very early on, when we have stuff about Hebrews and pagans and Christians and the like, a lot of that I think is actually allegorical in terms of body, soul, and spirit. And also, because I'm touching on this in my new book on the Gnostic soul, which looks at the hymn of the pill and the exegesis on the soul, and the general Gnostic view of what the soul was, in the context of other religions and traditions as well, because the persistence of the concept of the soul, and also the many similarities in all these different cultures, is I find fascinating. But in the Gnostic tradition, the soul is really the part that is most typically us. We're not our bodies, and then the spirit is something more transcendent, more divine. But the soul tends to get stuck to matter, and there's the famous categorization of people according to whether they're hylics from hyle, matter, or whether they're psychics from psyche, soul, or they're pneumatics from pneuma, spirit. The soul tends to become caught into matter, and what we're meant to do is rather to connect it to spirit instead. And then that's when we can take part in the pleroma, and we really transcend. We escape, basically. We escape the world. But then there is this curious reference to the middle. I mean, if you're entrapped in matter, I suppose there's still some chance of escaping, because we're in this world and there are paths in this world, or techniques, ways, whatever, in which we can use so our souls can escape. But somehow, if we've just become stuck as souls, that's the worst case at all. It does seem like a limbo or purgatory, perhaps. I haven't quite settled my ideas about it, but
where do you see the ego? Well, this ego would be the soul, right?
Yes, I guess so, yes.
So it's not a matter of ego, to the Valentinians, it's not a matter of ego death, but the ego being the vehicle to, or the tool to allow the spirit to escape.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Or the lower self, or the false self, I suppose, is another way that the soul becomes trapped, perhaps crystallized in a way. The piece that you mentioned in the Pistis Sophia, again, it connects the soul with these terrible things that are happening. So, that's part of the cosmological teaching. In my book, I've really focused more on the psychological side in terms of the allegory and the metaphor. But of course, there was quite an elaborate cosmology for Gnosticism in general, and also for Valentinianism.
And it was all based basically on Middle Platonic philosophy. Even the tripartition of the man is Platonic.
Yes, well, Plato's was a little different. He had the rational soul and those sort of things. I don't think it matches exactly, but yes, I think it has a lot in common with it. Although curiously, Plotinus, who was counts as a Neoplatonist, hated Gnosticism. He attacked it in his Aeneads. But also Philo, who was a Platonist. His works were also concerned with allegory, and he had these extensive allegorical interpretations of the Torah, particularly Genesis, that have a very strong connection to the sort of thing that's going on in Gnosticism and the Gospel of Thomas. So I think and also there's some evidence that Gnostics, second century Gnostics, had read him, and certainly Clement of Alexandria and Origen, though they weren't Gnostics, they inherited the tradition of interpretation that Philo used.
Before we go, it seems the advice you would give to the reader, anybody reading the Gospel of Philip, is do not do what Dan Brown and Holy Blood, Holy Grail do, and read it as allegorically as possible.
Yes, that's what it is. It even gives a method of interpretation. In one of the sections, it says that names given to the worldly are a source of confusion, for they turn hearts away from what really exists, and make them think of that which does not exist. So then someone who thinks of God does not think of what really exists, but of something that doesn't actually exist. And it goes on with a list of things that, when we talk about resurrection or life or light, we're not meant to be taking these literally. They're an indication of the things that really exist, but names that we have in this world are deceptive. And the Gospel of Philip is, it's interested in names and, in a way, playing with this material, but the idea is to transcend the terminology and just the intellectual interest in it. And I don't think it has any interest in the history of Christianity or the life of Jesus.
Or anything dogmatic, for that matter.
No. No, if somebody really, really wants Jesus to be married to Mary Magdalene, then, I don't believe this myself, because the Gospel of Philip is an anthology, it doesn't mean that everything, including the Gospel of Philip, was meant to be interpreted in the way that the Gospel of Philip would like it to be interpreted. So, if it's an anthology, then the little bits about Mary Magdalene would come from an earlier source, perhaps from an earlier Gospel. And perhaps that Gospel was meant to be taken literally, in which case you can have Jesus married to Mary Magdalene, and precedes the Gospel of Philip by a few generations. Now, I don't believe that for a minute myself, but
right.
If you really are committed to Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene, then that's the way to do it. On the other hand, Jesus is also married to Sophia in a syzygy in one Gnostic text quoted by Irenaeus. So, he can be married to Sophia as well if you want. Perhaps Sophia was his second wife.
Polygamy. He must have been a Mormon. Oh, Lord. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you very much for coming on, and we definitely hope to have you on soon.
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about my next book.
Oh, certainly, yeah. As soon as it comes out, we will get you on, because the subject matter, the Hymn of the Pearl and the Exeges of the Soul are some of the most beautiful and fascinating parts of Gnosticism, without a doubt.
Yes, it's very beautiful, and also very, in a similar way to the Gospel of Philip, very accessible. And a lot of the classical Gnostic texts, like the Apocryphon of John, they do take quite a bit of effort to read. They have all these strange names and they jump about from place to place. But the Valentinian tradition is much more accessible now.
And when do you think the books will be out?
The Gnostic Soul is scheduled to come out spring 2007.
All right, well, we'll definitely have you on there. Once again, thanks for being on, and have a good day.
And you.
And that was Andrew Philip Smith, helping us, like the Pink Floyd song Echoes goes, climb slowly towards the light. And yes, the heavy breathing you heard during the interview was not me looking at pictures of Christina Ricci and her luscious forehead, or pictures of Demi Moore's haircut in St. Elmo's Fire. That was simply my usual problems with Skype and so forth. But one day, I promise you, Truth Seekers, I'll get it fixed. Probably the same day that I start going live. Anywho, this has been Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis. And in conclusion, let me quote from Songs of Kabir, book number 27. In the field of this body, a great war goes forward, against passion, anger, pride, and greed. It is in the kingdom of truth, contentment, and purity that this battle is raging. And the sword that rings forth most loudly is the sword of his name. Kabir says, when a brave knight takes the field, a host of cowards is put to flight. It is a hard fight and a weary one, this fight of the truth seeker. For the vow of the truth seeker is more hard than that of the warrior, or of the widowed wife who would follow her husband. For the warrior fights for a few hours, and the widow's struggle with death is soon ended. But the truth seeker's battle goes on day and night, as long as life lasts.